HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, How the FBI Aided and Abetted the Rise of White Christian Nationalism, by Lerone Martin. Read by Langston, Darby. Prologue. Suing the FBI. I sued the FBI to write this book. On August 12, 2018, I filed suit against the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, for FBI records on Billy Graham, Martin v. United States Department of Justice, 2018, case number 18-1885. I was convinced the preacher had an FBI file. No American in the mid-20th century could reach his level of fame, notoriety, and influence, yet managed to escape the vigilant prying eyes of Hoover's FBI. And no civilian was permitted into Hoover's inner sanctum for a stage photograph without knowingly or unknowingly enduring a thorough background check. In one way or another, Graham was involved with the FBI, and I thought the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, was the key to find out how. But I was wrong. The FBI played hardball, so I sued. It was my only recourse, a desperate attempt to force the FBI to abide by the FOIA. Revelation is the purpose of the modern FOIA. President Lyndon Johnson signed it into law on Independence Day, 1966. LBJ publicly praised the bill, which gave Americans the opportunity to petition for records of U.S. executive branch agencies. This legislation springs from one of our most essential principles: a democracy works best when the people have all the information that the security of the nation permits, he proudly announced. Privately, however, the president despised the bill, allowing it to languish on his desk. Johnson finally signed the fucking thing, as he scornfully referred to it, after much persuasion, narrowly ducking its pocket veto. His reluctant attitude foreshadowed how executive branch agencies would execute the law. My ordeal with Graham gave me first-hand experience with their approach. I made my original FOIA request on February 21, 2018. It was the day Graham died, and his legal privacy rights, at least in textual materials, went to the grave with him. The FBI acknowledged my FOIA request, yet failed to make a determination within the 20-day statutory deadline mandated by Congress. The FBI did not bother to claim unusual or exceptional circumstances to excuse their malfeasance. They just ignored me. I heard from the Bureau almost 2 months later. The April letter was as bold as the typeface in which it was set. The Bureau did not concede breaking the law. They simply informed me that they would not disclose or even acknowledge the existence of any records concerning Billy Graham and his relationship to law enforcement or national security. These were significant and ironic exclusions for Graham. The preacher had advised U.S. presidents for more than half a century, advocating evangelical Christianity as the key to national security, yet there would be no disclosures. If the FBI determined there were files that resided outside of this broad purview, they pledged to make them public via their FOIA website at some undisclosed date in the future. Then and only then would I be informed. The Trump DOJ dug in their heels. This should not have been surprising. President Donald Trump's Attorney General, William Barr, was constantly lambasting the FOIA as a dangerous nuisance that amounted to constant harassment of the DOJ. I decided to join the torrent of disturbance filing suit in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. The civil litigation produced a saga of hide and seek, lost and found. The FBI admitted a number of records on Graham had been destroyed in accordance with a 1986 court order. The ruling created the FBI Records Retention Plan, a rubric that assigns preservation schedules for FBI files based on their potential research value. More than 3 decades later, the same court informed me that records pertaining to the nation's most famous evangelist had been legally destroyed by the FBI. What was valuable to me was deemed legally disposable by the FBI. Worse, the FBI testified that other files had been lost or were unable to be located. Judge Christopher R. Cooper, an Obama appointee, supervised the FBI as it located and turned over files on a rolling basis. The FBI produced a deluge of documents detailing investigations of deranged death threats targeting Graham, as well as an obsessive amount of newspaper clippings covering the preacher's whereabouts and statements. However, there was nothing detailing Graham's relationship to Hoover, the FBI, or any other executive agency. The promised transparency of President Biden's administration provided false hope. In July 2021, Kathleen Molen, Assistant United States Attorney, AUSA, for the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, brought good tidings. AUSA Molen informed my counsel, Tuan Samahan, the FBI has located a file that it had previously been unable to locate. The FBI indicates that the file is related to Billy Graham. With no explanation, the FBI miraculously found a 30-page file on Billy Graham. I did not care if it was the result of an actual miracle, political timing, or just the correction of incompetence. I counted it a godsend. But my joy was short-lived. The once lost, now found file was largely more of what I had already received. But I refused to stop. The case was settled, with the DOJ agreeing to pay for attorney fees and other litigation costs. Upon turning my attention to Graham's official archives, I quickly learned the FBI had a co-conspirator in its archival cover-up. Shortly after my public lawsuit, Billy Graham's son, Franklin Graham, a staunch right-wing evangelist, announced Billy Graham's archival holdings would be moved from their original longtime home of Wheaton College to North Carolina. This may not have been a coincidence. The FBI has a practice of releasing high-visibility memoranda, warning various government and civic entities of a proposed release of high-profile files and the possible fallout. The Bureau denied the existence of such a memo in my case. However, the result was the same. Billy Graham's family took cover, protecting Billy Graham's legacy as the figurehead and proxy of modern white evangelicalism at all costs. Now Graham's archival holdings, dating back to 1940, are under the complete control and supervision of the Graham family, specifically Franklin Graham, and cannot be accessed without his blessing. The younger Graham is the latest in a long line of white evangelicals vying to protect and police the legacy of modern white evangelicalism and its complicated relationship with white Christian nationalism. Pioneering white evangelical institutions such as Christianity Today, the National Association of Evangelicals, and the National Religious Broadcasters have scrubbed detailed references to J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI from their respective archives. The deafening silence led me to seek FBI files on the white evangelical world that surrounded Billy Graham, the clergy, churches, magazines, and organizations the evangelist helped to establish, the foundational entities of modern white evangelicalism. My labor was not in vain. The pages that follow draw upon thousands of newly declassified and released FBI files. The revelations therein are enhanced by my interviews with FBI special agents who worked for Hoover. Together, they show that J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI were central to post-war religion and politics. Hoover's FBI joined forces with the founding architects of white evangelicalism to aid and abet the rise of white Christian nationalism as a legitimate force in American politics. The gospel of J. Edgar Hoover moves this partnership out of the shadows and into the light. This discovery illuminates the past, helping to explain 21st century U.S. religion and politics. Following a string of white Christian nationalist violence, most notably the January 6, 2021 attack on the nation's capital, the FBI announced renewed efforts to squarely deal with the domestic security threat of white Christian nationalism. The Bureau's mission will be hampered if it does not trace the multiple origins, dwelling places, and institutional expressions of the threat, even if that trail leads all the way back to FBI headquarters and field offices. Likewise, many prominent white evangelicals have stated a desire to better understand when and how white nationalism came to possess a large portion of the movement. They believe this quest will help exorcise the demons. This book calls them to reconsider the very foundations of modern white evangelicalism, to reckon with the fact that the groundwork was laid, in part, by J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI. Introduction. J. Edgar Hoover's Stained Glass Window. On a Sunday morning, June 26, 1966, the Capitol Hill Methodist Church dedicated a magnificent 33-foot-tall stained glass window to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. It was the congregation's second worship service in their new $1 million church, an expenditure of about $17 million today. The prominent 1,200-member all-white congregation, located just 5 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, purposely built the new church, precisely on the spot of the birthplace of Mr. Hoover. The church was erected as an evangelical shrine to J. Edgar Hoover, and the glorious window was consecrated, the J. Edgar Hoover window. With J. Edgar Hoover seated in the front pew, Protestants of all stripes praised him as a Christian champion. Hoover's pastor, Reverend Dr. Edward L. R. Elson, spoke for the masses of white evangelicals. The Presbyterian clergyman was a founding contributor to Christianity Today, the literary mouthpiece of modern white evangelicalism. He told the congregation that naming the window after Hoover was eminently merited and highly appropriate. The pastor of the Methodist Church, Reverend Edward Lewis, preached the sermon. The shepherd of the largest white Protestant church in Washington, D.C., chose the divine calling of Samuel as his biblical text. His sermon drew a parallel between Samuel and Hoover. Samuel answered God's call to turn Israel away from sin and idolatry and toward God. J. Edgar Hoover had done likewise. He heeded God's call to turn America away from subversion and back to God. The congregation received the sermon by offering thanks for Hoover's service, followed by a plea that he would be the first among many white male Christian defenders. "We honor today a man of Christian stature and national leadership," they prayed. "We offer our thanks to thee for such men as J. Edgar Hoover, and pray that more like men will be forthcoming in our nation." Methodist Bishop Wilbur E. Hamaker offered the prayer of dedication after he confessed to being an unashamed hero worshiper of Hoover. The virulent anti-communist elder blessed the window. "In the name of the Father, Almighty God, I dedicate the J. Edgar Hoover window at the Capitol Hill Methodist Church, in the shadow of the nation's capital, proclaiming to the throngs that will see it that Christian virtues produce great statesmanship." A large tablet was blessed and fixed on the interior and exterior of the window for all to see. The J. Edgar Hoover window, statesmanship through the Christian virtues, dedicated on June 26, 1966, to J. Edgar Hoover, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who was born on this site January 1st, 1895. The service culminated with a congregational prayer of nationalism. The faithful beseeched God for salvation, not by supernatural means, but through Hoover and his federal agency. "We are grateful for the consistent work of the Federal Bureau of Investigation under his leadership," they prayed in unison. "Through their direction, make us citizens who honor God." Why did white evangelicals look to J. Edgar Hoover to lead them to salvation when the FBI director was not a born-again Christian? Why did they crown him their political champion when court cases such as Copeland v. United States 1950 revealed the FBI director regularly ordered his agents to conduct unlawful break-ins and unconstitutional surveillance and to lie about it under oath? Why was Hoover deemed the aspirational model of white Christian manhood and the foremost protector of family values when he never married, but for more than 3 decades enjoyed a domestic partnership with the FBI's second-in-charge, Special Agent Clyde Tolson? And perhaps most important, what does this glorification of J. Edgar Hoover tell us about the FBI and modern white evangelicalism? The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover answers these questions. It explains why white evangelicals, from the pulpit to the pew, from the local church to the international parachurch, honored FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover as an anointed leader. Specifically, the book chronicles how Hoover built up the FBI as a white Christian force that partnered with white evangelicals to aid and abet the rise of white Christian nationalism. This story is not a rumination of an evangelical outsider. I was saved in the evangelical tradition and educated in its white institutions. This is not a narrative of decline in which a once pure faith was hijacked by disingenuous political operatives beginning in the 1970s. Rather, it is a history of the modern origins of white evangelical moral and political norms. What follows, then, is not a history of the white evangelical fringe, nor an accounting of white evangelical exceptions. It is a story that details how foundational figures and entities of mainstream white evangelicalism and the everyday faithful willingly partnered with J. Edgar Hoover and the extra-legal practices of his FBI to bring America back to their God. White Christian nationalism, the impulse to make whiteness and conservative Christianity the foundation and guidepost of American governance and culture, has received renewed attention in public discourse of late. Histories of its development in post-war America have rightly centered on the influence of white evangelical Christianity. Studies have identified clergy, politicians, captains of industry, Hollywood, the military, and suburbanization as driving forces of white Christian nationalism. White evangelicals confronted the New Deal, the Cold War, and the Civil Rights Movement by merging their Jesus with American notions of whiteness, virulent anti-communism, capitalism, hypermasculinity, and political conservatism. The FBI was a major part of this landscape, yet it has been overlooked. President Franklin Roosevelt issued a series of presidential directives in the 1930s, which morphed Hoover's FBI from a small outfit investigating interstate crimes to the nation's largest domestic intelligence agency. As the bulwark of national security, the Bureau was conspicuous in American anti-communism. Hoover and his all-white male Christian force of special agents served as the producers, directors, and stars of the ideological drama that was the Cold War. Hoover and his FBI set the table upon which white evangelicals feasted. The FBI also served as the clearinghouse of national belonging, defending the status quo and regulating who should participate in the democratic process. Hoover's white Christian nationalist worldview determined legitimate statecraft from subversion and godliness from atheism. Narrow definitions of evangelicalism have hindered us from perceiving Hoover's evangelical significance. Scholars and journalists have largely relied on professionally defined theological commitments, ultimate biblical authority, Christ atonement, conversion, prayer, evangelicalism, social reform, and church membership to determine who is in the white evangelical camp. However, salvation is a cosmic matter for white evangelicals, far too important to leave exclusively in the hands of theological and professional elites. White evangelical faith has never lived by theology alone, but by the very practices of the faithful. It is a lived faith, a religious identity that is constructed and maintained in daily practices, consumption habits, voting, political affiliations, that take place outside of official evangelical institutions. And the lived experience of post-war white evangelicalism has been marked by steadfast commitments to white Christian nationalism, a worldview and cultural framework centered on the fusion of American civic life and a particular Christian identity. This all-encompassing faith assumes the naturalness and righteousness of nativism, white supremacy, patriarchal authority, heteronormativity, gender difference, and militarism. These evangelical commitments made J. Edgar Hoover a white evangelical not by virtue of being born again, nor by church membership or name, but by something far more important: his fight for a white Christian nationalist nation. As the editors of Christianity Today joyfully announced in 1962, J. Edgar Hoover was not only a part of the message of white evangelicalism, he was also part of its mission. Hoover was an important part of the evangelical errand. He did not simply ride the wave of Cold War evangelicalism. He helped to create it. He fused together virulent anti-communism with what would become the other political hallmarks of the movement: anti-statist statism, Christian traditionalism, subplot epistemology, and individual liberty. Hoover's career embodied anti-statist statism. He bemoaned the rise of the New Deal liberal state, yet he owed his increasing power to the very same enlarged federal apparatus. He welcomed government involvement in American life when it enforced his traditional Christian notions of sexuality, gender, and race. Yet he decried the tentacles of big government when state reforms ran counter to his beliefs, i.e., racial integration, school busing, voting protections. His subplot epistemology saw an existential crisis behind every political difference. Hoover did not view actions, ideas, or policies that countered his Christian worldview as simply differing opinions. Rather, Hoover saw those differences as subplots to a grand cosmic conspiracy to destroy the nation. Therefore, His commitment to individual liberty hinged upon virtue. Liberty was not licentiousness, but an ordered freedom in which government helped to cultivate virtuous individual souls. Virtue stood guard, protecting liberty. Statecraft had to be soulcraft. Hoover's faith served as the foundation of it all, a white Christian nationalism that wedded conservative Christianity and American statecraft. The nation, he once told an NBC audience, had to have faith to be free. When post-war white evangelical conservatives heard the gospel of Hoover, they believed they heard the gospel truth. Studies of the FBI have also been slow to pinpoint this gospel. Scholars of the Bureau rarely consider the director's faith, let alone its influence upon the Bureau and the nation. Yet, during Hoover's lifetime, his faith in storied religious partnerships were central to how Americans understood him and his Bureau. Histories of the FBI have chronicled the FBI's surveillance of clergy and its antagonism toward faith communities. This book narrates the Bureau's embrace and promotion of faith. Previous histories have identified which religious folk Hoover deemed subversive: Dorothy Day, Father Berrigan, Fannie Lou Hamer, Malcolm X. Now it is time to focus on which clergy the FBI boss branded as partners. The Bureau had many enemies, but it also had plenty of friends. History has shown us how the Bureau attempted to silence its enemies, hindering democratic debate, and ultimately push American politics toward an authoritarian far right. The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover offers a new story, detailing how the religious commitments of Hoover and his FBI also ushered our nation's politics toward the religious right. The following pages tell the story. Part 1, Proselytizing Faith, displays how Hoover, the longest-standing high-level appointee in U.S. government history, made white Christian nationalism the bedrock of the modern national security state. U.S. presidents came and went, as did ruling political paradigms and crises, but Hoover remained. As FBI director from 1924 until his death in 1972, Hoover was a political constant, paying lip service to the Constitution, but establishing white Christian nationalism as the actual foundation of his FBI. It mattered little who was in office or which party was in control of Congress. Faith helped him determine the nation's enemies and how they should be attacked and defeated. He saw national security in cosmic terms. Nothing was more existential than national security, the very salvation of the nation's soul. Hoover remade the FBI, the federal agency in charge of the nation's domestic security, in his own image, a squadron of white men who viewed themselves as white Christian soldiers and ministers. They were spiritually and morally formed by the FBI's religious culture, a suite of religious practices that took on both Catholic and Protestant forms. Hoover's white Christian nationalism eschewed the rampant anti-Catholicism of the day in favor of a unified white Christian order. Maintaining a white Christian nation required that all respectable white Christian men join the struggle, regardless of ecclesiastical commitments or theological differences. As part of their training, FBI special agents pledged to be Christian soldiers and ministers, while also attending FBI spiritual retreats and special worship services run by leading white Catholic and Protestant clergy. The FBI made it very clear: a secure and safe America was a Christian America, one in which white evangelicals and conservative white Catholics worked together to maintain the levers of cultural and political power. The FBI was the nation.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?